have to figure out a couple outfits for the budget hearing. See if we can.
Good afternoon. New York Public Transit Association, Capital District Transport Authority, and Bill, you're in front. You're not Mr. Basili.
I'm not that good looking, no, Mr. Chairman.
All righty. Bill Carpenter. How are you?
Very good. Thank you, Chairman Farrell, Chairwoman Young, for giving NYPTA, the New York Public Transit Association, the opportunity to testify today about the Governor's proposed 2016-17 executive budget. My name is Bill Carpenter. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Rochester-Genesee Regional Transportation Authority and Vice President for NYPTA. NYPTA members include transit systems, private sector manufacturers and suppliers, state agencies, and community advocates. Communities throughout New York benefit from the services provided from more than 100 public transit systems. Our members serve urban and rural areas, enabling mobility and connections that keep our state moving. We know the metropolitan New York City area cannot function without high-quality transit services provided by the MTA. The same is true for the cities and towns in upstate New York and throughout the state. Today, more than ever, we need high-quality transit to allow our citizens to fully participate in economic opportunities. Mobility choices provided by transit systems support many of the state's important programs: economic development, job growth, anti-poverty, housing, energy conservation, and environmental protection. Well-planned and thoughtful transit services are essential to moving people to jobs in cities and expanding suburban and rural areas, while also providing access to health care, to schools, to colleges, and universities. Transit provides our growing senior population and people with disabilities the freedom and choices they need to live their lives and participate in society. Transit ridership is growing in many communities, and systems are responding by making services easier to use and understand. Innovative technologies are making fare payment easier. Real-time information applications are in many of our systems, along with customer features that make using the bus and trains inviting and appealing. Our growing popularity is why we're asking for an appropriate investment in transit so we can provide more and better services to our communities. The Governor's executive budget includes increases to transit operating aid. This level of funding will allow transit systems to maintain current systems and services, but it will not allow us to expand and meet customer expectations that support the state's economic development initiatives. To allow transit systems to fully support the economic opportunities that citizens deserve, NYPTA recommends an additional $15 million in operating aid for upstate transit systems and $5 million for downstate suburban county transit systems. And a structural fix to upstate funding is still needed so that future growth is not constrained. There's also a need for a multi-year statewide transit capital program. For far too long, the capital needs of upstate and downstate suburban transit systems have been an afterthought. All of us have diverted federal capital funding to subsidize operations. In essence, we're borrowing from tomorrow to pay for services today. It's not sustainable, and we're at a critical crossroads. The time to fix this and to invest in transit is now. New York transit systems across the state lack the consistent capital investment needed. It's led to worsening infrastructure conditions and unnecessary maintenance expenses. Let me give a couple examples. In Buffalo, where buses are supposed to last every 12 years, 46% of the buses are beyond their useful life. Here in Albany, 20% of the buses are beyond their useful life. They're twice as expensive to maintain as newer buses. In Rochester, our campus facility where buses are maintained, they're washed, fueled. The campus is 40 years old and we lack the capital to renovate and expand the campus. In Syracuse and Nassau County, they have 20-year-old CNG facilities for fueling their buses that need to be replaced. The governor has committed $8.3 billion to fund the MTA 5-year capital plan. His goal is to transform the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and to dramatically improve the travel experience for millions of New Yorkers and visitors to the metropolitan region. We support this initiative and the money to accomplish it. But transit customers in upstate and downstate communities deserve the same transformation, and we're asking for the same fully funded multi-year capital program. In total, our systems operate 3,000 buses and serve over 170 million customers every year. 3,000 buses, 170 million customers outside the MTA. Collectively, we would be the 7th largest transit system in the United States. The executive budget proposes a $295 million capital program for non-MTA transit systems as part of the $22 billion DOT 5-year program. We thank the governor for recognizing our work, but the proposed funding is not enough to address the backlog of infrastructure needs of our systems. NYPTA recommends a state capital investment of at least $100 million per year in upstate and suburban downstate systems to allow them to modernize the aging infrastructure. To achieve this level and provide funding to these systems in proportion to the state capital being provided to the MTA, we're looking for the $295 million to be increased to $545 million. In rural transit service, transit systems in the rural parts of the upstate region are suffering from severe ridership loss as a result of the state's change in the way Medicaid transportation is arranged. The decline in riders and revenue in rural upstate systems has resulted in service reductions to the general public and is threatening the viability of services to those who need them most. NYPTA recommends the state provide additional funding to rural transit systems so essential systems can be retained. In conclusion, transit service provides mobility for a growing customer base. It allows everyone to participate in the economic rebirth of our communities. NYPTA members appreciate the funding and support we receive. We ask for consideration of the capital and operating needs of our systems so we can do more. Increased investments in transit will result in better service and more cost-effective delivery of that service. This investment will also ensure thousands of jobs for state transit manufacturers and suppliers. A fully funded transit capital and operating plan helps all New Yorkers have the mobility choices they want and need. On behalf of both NYPTA and RGRTA, I urge Governor Cuomo and the legislature to support a better network of transit systems in New York State that can contribute to economic growth. NYPTA is committed to working with the governor and all of you so transit continue to be a strong partner. Thank you very much.
Question?
Thank you very much for being here today. And you may have heard me question Commissioner Driscoll earlier about upstate transit and the fact that there does seem to be a structural problem that needs to be addressed. And in addition, the capital needs that you have spoken of. He countered with the governor's proposal of $5 million in an increase. Could you give us your thoughts in a more in-depth way about what that $5 million would do? Is that enough? What other needs are there? And how can the legislature be helpful in this regard?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman Young. We were, as an industry, since 2009, funding was essentially held flat for a good number of years. First a reduction in 2009, and then slow increases to where we had flat funding a number of years ago. As the state economy has improved and the poverty levels have also increased, the urban transit systems are experiencing a tremendous interest in services. Jobs are being located in the outer suburban areas. So where everyone would like to do more with less, the fact of the matter is public transit is being asked to do more to serve our communities, to be the mobility infrastructure. The $5 million increase proposed in the executive budget does provide kind of a baseline funding where we could continue to maintain the services we have. But I receive calls, I'll just speak for RGRTA, I receive calls on a regular basis from places like Xerox and Webster that are adding hundreds of jobs at a call center that we don't serve right now. We didn't serve it when they opened it. They're repurposing manufacturing facilities to add jobs. These are good paying jobs for people who live in the center of our community. How do we get them there? Those are the kinds of opportunities we're looking for. Jobs are being expanded where the factories are, where the land is. We need to connect individuals. The anti-poverty initiatives as well, we're being asked to redesign how we do systems. Rochester was the first community to start an anti-poverty initiative this time last year. We're being challenged to, you need to do things not just differently, but you need to do different things. You need to keep connecting people where they're going to, so don't stop doing that. But we have a need for additional services. So that's where the increased ask comes from, is for us to be able to be partners in the success of economic development.
Thank you very much. Senator Krueger has a question or more.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't really leave during your testimony. I just hid behind you to drink my soup.
It's a better sign.
I agree with you on the importance of mass transit as an economic development tool in every region. I'm from New York City. We wouldn't be the city we are without our mass transit, even though we're constantly struggling to get it to function better and more. Your demands every year don't seem unreasonable to me at all. I'm curious, because this state has been putting so much money into its regional economic development councils and now these competitive regional economic, I guess, contests. So recently the governor awarded $500 million each to 3 regions. Is money coming into mass transit in your territory through either of these 2 big bucket economic development programs?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The short answer is no. And when we talk about that, what we're told is the pockets of money that these come from different economic development pots or energy conservation pots, they're not mass transit pots, they're not Department of Transportation pots. So what the governor has done is collect different economic development and other program pots. I serve as a co-chair for one of the subcommittees for the Finger Lakes Regional Economic Development Council. So I work well in prioritizing the projects. I do include projects that would benefit RGRTA. The projects have scored well, but I've been told the pots of money that go into the regional economic development councils are not pots that would help build bus facilities or provide operating aid.
I appreciate the answer. I guess this is more a rhetorical statement than a question for you. I have been fairly outspoken with my concerns about how the New York State government divvies up its budget money for things we call economic development, and have been a bit cynical about ignoring certain priority areas, but having seemingly every year new money for new competitions. I think it's a shame that the state of New York doesn't recognize the importance of public transit, mass transit, statewide, as a fundamental economic development tool. If you don't have the infrastructure, they don't stay and they don't come. And transportation infrastructure, for me, is a no-brainer. So I hope that, for whoever's listening, that the state of New York, as it defines what we call economic development and when we continue to do these regional economic council contests every year, and perhaps we'll see more, I guess, contests in general for regions, that please, please, please recognize that mass transit, public transportation has to be an allowable activity within those funds, because, you know, you are here representing a very broad universe of public and mass transit efforts, and they all do need the money and deserve the money. And before I ask the Thruway Authority, or I compliment on the Thruway Authority for knowing how little we actually spend per mile or demand from people per mile, do you ever do any analysis of the New York State's investment in public transportation compared to other states? Because I feel that we probably are lagging behind. Do you know?
First of all, it's a very good rhetorical question on whether money from the economic pots should come to mass transit. I'll just leave it at that. As far as how New York State compares with public transportation, I serve not just as vice president for NYPTA, but also serve on the board of directors for the American Public Transportation Association. The funding mechanisms across the 50 states are very different, with some counting on property tax, some on sales tax, some on income tax, and some on state funding. So I don't know that as an association we've ever been able to identify. Ohio is an example which passes sales tax referendums to pay for their public transit, would have much less state funding than New York State. But other states that do a heavy state funding, because of the MTA, New York State does pretty well. Many other systems have some local control of funding, but it's really very different state to state.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Assemblyman Oaks?
Yes, thank you. Just your last point in your presentation, you talked about the rural transportation and the issues of the changes in Medicaid, and I think Senator O'Meara, earlier part of today's discussion, actually brought up this issue. Could you just quickly explain what's changed and what needs to happen to, you know, my interest is getting people to where they need to be and also doing it in the most efficient, cost-effective way, but
I don't know if there's a simple answer to that, Assemblyman. The Department of Health has some specific guidelines they're trying to follow. The consequences of those guidelines are public transit is not getting the same opportunities to provide transportation to Medicaid recipients. The loss of those rides, because the formula funding in many of these counties is based on the miles and customers you carry. You lose not just the Medicaid ride, but you lose that other funding. So that in some counties, we're reaching the point where a person can get a cab ride from home to the doctor and back again. But when they want to buy some food or get their prescription filled, there's no longer public transit access to get them where else they need to go. So that it needs to be looked at with the full consequences. That the change the Department of Health made is one broker is deciding who gets who's the provider for the transportation, and public transportation is not getting as favorable a treatment as it had prior to that change a few years ago.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Associated General Contractors, New York State, Mike Elmendorf, President, 12:15.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Young, Chairman Farrell, members of the legislature. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you for your patience. It's been a long day already, and out of consideration for that, I will dispense with my formal testimony, which you have, and I will summarize it and try to hit on some of the key points for our industry. I'm Mike Elmendorf, President and CEO of the Associated General Contractors of New York State. We're New York State's leading statewide construction industry association. We represent the vertical building construction industry and the heavy highway and civil contractors that build the majority of the state's public and private building infrastructure, our transportation, heavy civil, and environmental infrastructure in every region of New York. And as we look at Governor Cuomo's proposed executive budget, there are certainly a lot of good things there for our industry, for the economy. There are some things that I think we can improve upon, and there are some things that I think we have some real concerns about. Very broadly, I'll hit three areas, so hopefully there's time for some questions and time for me to get on my way and you all in your collective ways, because, again, we've been sitting here for a while. Starting with the MTA, we strongly support the governor's historic commitment to help meet the really significant, real, documented capital needs of the MTA. He's committed additional $8.3 billion to meet the MTA's capital needs over the next 5 years, and it just makes good sense to do that. The MTA is critical to the New York City and the broader New York City metro region's economy, but more than that, it's critical to the whole state's economy. And I'll get to a broader discussion of this when we talk about DOT and parity. But New York City's economy drives the state's economy to a significant degree, and investing in the MTA creates economic activity well beyond the MTA metro region. You have train cars being built up far in the North Country, and there's other impact around the state. So you can't think about these issues as upstate and downstate, and that's why we strongly support the MTA investment, and our contractors in that region who will do that work support it, and our contractors elsewhere in the state support it as well. Moving on to the Thruway Authority, we're glad to see the governor's commitment to the Thruway. The Thruway is a vital network for the state and for our economy. I think it's fair to say, as we did last year, we have some concerns about what appears to be a growing pattern of state subsidy of what should really be and always was a toll-supported system. And I think that that's something that we're going to need to look at, because it's not really new money when you look at what the Thruway is getting. It's dollars, whether they're settlement dollars or state dollars, that are supplanting what would be toll revenues within the Thruway that have always supported their system. And their system has real substantial needs. The Thruway is somewhat unique in terms of infrastructure because it was all built at about the same time, and as a result, it's all coming of age at about the same time, and it has significant needs developing at about the same time. And the fact is, if you go to Western New York, there's now a stretch of the Thruway where you actually have a reduced speed limit because the conditions have gotten so bad, because due to a variety of reasons which really are beyond the Thruway Authority's control, there's been delay of a reconstruction project. But I think that shows you what the future of the Thruway is if they don't have the resources to make the investments that they need to in their system. And although nobody likes tolls, I think you have to wonder what happens in 2020 when the cap comes off the tolls. And realistically, we may well be looking at a significant toll increase, which is probably worse in the long term for the economy and for motorists than if you have reasonable incremental increases that can meet the Thruway's needs. One last point on the Thruway. We, for a long time, have been advocating for the transfer of the Canal Corporation out of the Thruway to somewhere else and to the Power Authority. We think it makes sense. As Executive Director Lehman testified, it is closer to the core function of the Power Authority than it is to the Thruway Authority. And it really should free up resources for the Thruway Authority. We're a little concerned that with that transfer, the transfer of the costs for Troop T that were affected last year are being undone, which makes that revenue neutral. We'd like to see both of those changes remain so that the Thruway has additional toll revenue to invest into their system. And finally, I want to talk about DOT and then have a conversation about parity. Commissioner Driscoll testified this morning that the governor's proposed a $20.1 billion 5-year DOT capital plan. And he's correct. It's the biggest DOT capital plan that's been proposed yet, and that's a very good thing. It's also a very good thing that it's a 5-year plan, because we haven't actually seen one of those proposed since, I think, the end of the last Bond Act in 2009 or so. So that's positive, and certainly the action in Washington that has resulted in finally the 10-year overdue passage of a surface transportation bill has helped make that long-term planning possible. So we thank our congressional delegation for that as well. But there's two things to look at. It being the biggest program ever doesn't mean that it meets the needs of DOT. And in fact, it's been since 2009 that we've had a public needs assessment from DOT. And in 2009, they said their 5-year needs were $25 billion. And as you know, they got nowhere near those resources. So those needs have only increased because there's been deterioration on the system since they didn't have the resources necessary to meet those needs. So that's number one. Number two is the issue of parity. And we were very glad to hear so many questions and comments and so much discussion earlier about parity. And I think it's important to clarify a couple of things, chiefly what is parity and what isn't parity. Parity is a defined word. It's not a term of art that was created to describe something here. It's the state of being equal. And in fact, that's what the DOT and MTA capital plans were until 2009, 2010, when parity was broken. And you can see that if you look at the written testimony. There's a chart in there. And why is that important? Well, it's important because both systems have needs. The MTA has been out talking about their needs, but DOT has significant needs too. Think about the Tappan Zee Bridge. Tappan Zee Bridge gets a lot of attention. The governor deserves a lot of credit for advancing that project. The bridge is in horrible shape. It needs to be replaced, needed to be replaced a long time ago. The governor tells a pretty amusing story about driving over the Tappan Zee Bridge and wondering if you should crack your window or undo your seatbelt or get ready to swim because the condition was so bad. And certainly it's half in jest, but the reality is that bridge was in very poor condition and something needed to be done. What you may not realize is there's about 600 bridges across New York in the state DOT system, local systems, and other authorities that are in as bad or worse condition than the Tappan Zee Bridge. So the needs for DOT are very clear as well. They're as important as the MTA's needs. Now, there's the issue of what number is parity. Well, the DOT plan is $20.1 billion. The $2 billion in throughway stabilization, the $1.3 billion from last year and the $700 million from this year, has never been part of that calculation. It is not part of the DOT capital plan, and it should not be part of the parity discussion. That's a separate issue. So when you're talking about straight parity, if the MTA capital plan is $26.1 billion over the next 5 years, that's what the DOT capital plan should be. And there is great documentation in both systems to indicate that that need is there. It should be funded. Both systems are critical to our economy. The other thing that parity isn't is an upstate-downstate issue. It drives me crazy when I hear people talk about it that way, and I appreciated, Senator Krueger, your comments and others earlier about that. The whole state relies on our statewide system of roads and bridges. I go to New York City regularly. I see roads and bridges. They're in need. And in fact, if you look at the DOT system, the biggest DOT project right now in New York State is the K Bridge in New York City. I talked about the statewide impact of the MTA system. This is not an upstate-downstate issue. It's not upstate-downstate parity. It's not an upstate road and bridge program. It is DOT MTA parity. It's what we always had. We have an historic opportunity to restore it this year and do the right thing for all the people of the state and meet our infrastructure needs. Our economies rely on it. Our economies don't work if our infrastructure is failing. We can't be open for business if our roads and bridges are closed. We can't be open for business if our transit systems are failing. And so this is an opportunity for the legislature and the executive to right the wrong that occurred several years ago due to a variety of fiscal and other circumstances when parity was broken, restore it, invest in our infrastructure, and put people back to work. And so we were glad to hear the governor commit to achieving parity. It's clear we've got some more work to do there. We're not there in the executive budget, but we're hopeful that with your support and ongoing conversations that we can get there. And if you look at the end of the testimony, we have an incredibly broad coalition of organizations that are supporting parity. It's really pretty extraordinary because it's a lot of groups and individuals that generally get paid to argue with each other, right? It's the whole of the business community, the whole of the construction industry, local governments, the mayors, counties, farmers, organized labor across the state, and the environmental community who all agree we need to fund the MTA system and fund the DOT system equitably, and so too do the people of New York, because there was a Siena College poll recently that showed that 71% of people, which is a big number on any issue, agree that both systems should be funded equitably. So that's a priority for us. We think the budget is a good starting point in many ways, but we think that there's some room for improvement. And one last point, one thing I would encourage you to look at, the budget proposes the creation of a New York State Design and Construction Office under the Dormitory Authority. And we look forward to learning more about exactly what the scope of that would be. But if what it's going to do is take control and management of construction projects away from agencies like DOT, OGS, State University Construction Fund, and others, I think we'd have some real concern about that, because there's a long history of our industry and our public partners in those agencies delivering quality, successful projects, and we should be able to continue to do that. We can improve the process, certainly, and we'd like to have those conversations too, but we'd be concerned about the authority for those projects shifting to this new entity. And with that, I will welcome any questions.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much. Making excellent points regarding parity and other issues, but especially parity and the fact that we need to invest as a state in our roads and bridges. We need to make sure that we restore a 5-year plan and that there's parity in the process and the plan, and transparency also as far as what those projects will entail. So thank you for your input.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Contracted Joshua Reap, Director of Government Affairs.